Guys, welcome back to another episode of Snowfall News. Sorry for the late release this week. Had some things I had to get out of the way, but we're back again, as always. And we're going to do the same thing I did last week, where I talked about some news that I could not cover in the full story. So first of all, Forza Horizon 6 came out. Very, very popular release. Been doing very well, surprisingly so. I never really played those games, but it seems to be doing incredibly well. People have been saying it's one of the better racing games we've had in quite some time, and I know that racing has been kind of stagnant at some end, so if you like that, check it out. The second one, Destiny 2, is ending its service, and we'll be doing a final patch June 9th, 2026. Last week we reported about Bungie and their relationship with Sony and how things have been a little bit tenuous on that front. Seems like this is kind of an extension of that, so very unfortunate. Like I said, I played a little bit of Destiny 2 when it first came out. Can't say I particularly, I thought it was pretty good. I did enjoy it, but I just didn't stick with it too much after that. But it's a shame to see it go that way. I know it's had a lot of ups and downs over the years, but it's a shame to see it end up canceling. And I think it's very telling about this spot that Bungie is in. I don't know if they're gonna make a Destiny 3 or not, but I suppose we'll end up seeing whatever it is that they decide to do in the case of Destiny 2. Those are the two things I want to speak on before that, so why don't we go ahead and get into the main stuff, shall we? So, speaking of Sony, Sony seems to be committing to full console exclusivity. I think the defining feature this past console generation has been the changing attitudes of a lot of the main console developers when it came to porting their games to different systems and consoles. Microsoft and Sony had adopted either an approach of limited time exclusivity, where players could play the games first on console, with the port coming 6 months later, or simply having the games be released on all the platforms at the same time. Even Nintendo had dipped their toes in this, not by releasing games on multiple platforms, but by being more willing to use their IPs on mobile, through games like Fire Emblem Heroes, the Animal Crossing mobile games, and a variety of other mobile titles. However, it seems the time of open borders and gaming is largely over. For the past year, Sony has been reticent on what games they've been deciding are getting the multi-platform treatment. Having already stated that their recent Ghosts of Yotei would not be getting a PC port like its prequel, Ghost of Tsushima. Ghost of Tsushima is also a really good game. If you haven't bought it yet, one of the few ones that are available on PC, very good game. Kind of Assassin's Creed-esque, so if you're kind of in that area, you'll like it. It's quite a good game. But anyway, this alongside other statements from the company had pointed to a lack of confidence from many that they are interested in continuing their strategy of porting games to other consoles after a time delay. A recent report from Bloomberg journalist Jason Schreier has essentially confirmed that all exclusives for the console moving forward will no longer be available only to the PlayStation console. Schreier reported that, in a town hall this past Monday, the company's main narrative-driven single-player games will no longer be exclusive. This is more than likely due to a number of factors, including the larger player base of PC players who willingly buy the software but were not at all interested in supporting the hardware side of things. In addition, as the newest generation of console rapidly approaches, it has been all but confirmed that the newest Xbox console will be capable of playing both Xbox and PC games. This would, effectively, mean that the next generation of Xbox hardware is capable of playing PlayStation games. And edge that most certainly rubs a lot of PlayStation execs the wrong way. For many PC players, this is no doubt will be rather sad news, as it has become almost expected for these games to make it onto the platform at some point in time. It also meant that you could simply invest in a PC and not have to ever worry about playing on any other hardware when an exclusive that you wanted came out. When it came to the Switch, which Nintendo is very adamant in never allowing games to be played on other hardware, it was more than possible to simply emulate due to the interest. But the same resources for the PS5 are not quite as readily available. I've always had my concerns about making your console exclusives available on PC for quite some time now. The gain you might get from the wider player base never seemed to me to outweigh the cons of simply lesser console sales. Granted, I never actually had the data on how many sales you're missing out versus people who might have never played the game anyway, but I've always been under the impression that it wasn't enough to really be worth it for the effort of making a PC port in the first place. That's another aspect of it I've always thought was perhaps a bit of a deterrent, and it was getting people with the know-how and the technical knowledge to make a port to the PC good in the first place. Because when a port is bad, PC players are very quick to not only let you know about it, but to abandon the game entirely, not even recommending it in the slightest to any of their friends. It came across as a market that was more trouble than it was worth, and perhaps that same thought might be going across Sony's mind, too. Next, Japanese devs speak out against pirating. One of the things I always find fascinating is just how different Japan is from not just the Western world in general, but from the United States in particular. In a lot of ways, it's almost like the polar opposite, if it wasn't for a lot of post-World War II changes to society to make them a little bit closer. And one of these aspects I always found very interesting, and perhaps a bit envious, was how they treat their intellectual property. Japanese developer Level 5, the studio best known for the 3DS Yokai Watch series, had spoken out after fans had begun to pirate their games. In an official notice from the company, they stated that anyone who was involved in piracy or modification of their titles would face legal actions from the company at large, whether they were domestic or abroad. They also then promptly asked that fans avoid using or downloading those copies, a statement that soon received backlash. It's kind of funny. You'd think that in any other... I feel like in any other, medium, you wouldn't expect... Well, no, it's correct, especially for music and things like that, right? It's very interesting that, when it comes to the consumer side of things, piracy has become such a huge part in consumer power over the entirety of the industry itself. It's very interesting. But anyway, Yokai Watch had a bit of a reputation for being one of the most expensive games to track down legal physical copies for, with many copies of the original reaching nearly $2,000. This was partly due to the limited run of the game, but also the low support for the overseas endeavors by Level 5 itself. Naturally, when games are this expensive, the fans turn to piracy to be able to play the game at all. This has become rather common procedure, especially for titles that can become more and more rare on the used games market. But Japan has an inherently different stance when it comes to pirating and emulating. This fundamental difference in thinking is largely what divides the overseas fans from the fans of Japan, and for many Japanese devs, this can be a rather rude awakening when you find that a lot of the fans for your game might not have bought to begin with. I can only imagine that a lot of this culture comes from the inherently creative-first mindset that a lot of Japanese gaming and fan cultures have, including the much more extensive and readily available second-hand market too. Now, I would hardly condemn people for turning to piracy when they have no other options. As I said, that's something that I have to do myself as well at times, but still I can't help but feel for developers when you see people playing the game you poured your heart and soul into completely for free, without a hint of guilt or regret. It is, and always will be, stealing from someone else, and while it offers consumers a degree of power over producers, it certainly can't help but feel awful. In that way, I can sympathize, but of course, when piracy is basically the only way you can play the game, that changes the dynamic at times. Speaking about games besides just Yokai Watch, it's not uncommon for games in Japan to simply be completely unavailable to fans overseas, localization or no. Sites will lock out foreign IP addresses, credit cards, and require Japanese addresses to even buy the content. When that happens, can you really blame people for having to steal to get what they want? It is a complicated discussion, and might not be one that the Western fans and Japanese fans can see eye to eye on, but it's certainly here to stay. Last, we have Party Animals Parties Hard with AI. Now, I've talked about AI and the effects on the gaming industry a number of times on the blog, and so it goes without saying that when it comes to gamers, they don't look very kindly on games that use it. In fact, they actually kind of hate it. Some games can get away with it to certain degrees, depending on how good they are, but most of the time they try to stay away from it, or at least they normally do. Recently, Party Animals had announced a community creator contest. If you don't know what Party Animals is, by the way, it's kind of like there was a game called Gang Beasts. It's kind of like one of those party games where you you tug on people and you push them around and they flop around and stuff. It's one of those games. Recently, they had announced a community creator contest where they wanted fans of the game to create video content. As far as fan engagement goes, this is pretty par for the course, usually in the form of art contests and like. What separated this one from all the others is that the developers of Party Animals had specifically asked everyone to make videos with AI, and only AI. It included things from the video itself, to the voiceovers, the assets. All of those had to have at least some kind of generative AI in the creative process, as this was a key rule to the campaign itself. It was called the Golden Paw Awards. The winner of the contest could get up to $15,000 in cash prizing, as well as a Golden Paw trophy. Not only that, but there would be multiple different categories for it. Needless to say, it did not go over well with the player base in the slightest. The game was very shortly after review bombed from orbit, with many players expressing complete and utter grief at having AI shoved into yet another part of their lives. It even went so far as people beginning to uninstall the game entirely. Seeing the backlash, the devs then put up a vote to the fans for them to decide on what happens to the contest. As someone who works in the PR field, I find this story particularly fascinating because it's terrible on so many different levels. I can't help but wonder how the idea itself even managed to make its way into consideration. Now, I've heard a lot of people call many teams tone deaf, but it's hard to see this as anything but. It borders on simply not paying attention to what's going on in the industry at all. While AI itself has very slowly become something that's normalized in a lot of corners, when it comes to creatives in gaming, it's deeply unpopular, with multiple controversies happening already to other companies for just having placeholders in the game that are AI made. I can't imagine Party Animals really ever letting this down, but maybe it'll serve as yet another lesson to people to read the room first and foremost. And that is it for this week's Snowfall news, guys. Thank you for watching. Sorry it's late once again, but we'll be back next week on time. So, see you then.